Thank you, Anne. That was a very gracious introduction. And thank you all for allowing me to come and share a little bit of my travels and my life and the things that I'm curious about with you. I think that this is wonderful that you have an Institute for Continued Learning. What a wonderful thing, and it looks as if you are very healthy, robust, and vibrant. And I want to join. So. I am primarily a fiction writer, but to get a lot of the ideas, I do quite a bit of traveling. And in 2008, I did spend some time in Latvia, and I was researching the latest novel that I wrote. It was set in Latvia, and while there, I found myself continually lost. That's just sort of my trademark thing I do, is I go places, I get lost, and then always, it seems, some kind of guardian angel comes and rescues me. So I was lost in Latvia, and this man kind of came to my rescue, and it turns out he was a really famous poet in Latvia and Sweden. And he said, you know, I know just about everybody in Latvia. Let me just take you around, since he realized I wanted to research Latvia. So we were in Riga one day, and I remember we were sitting and having coffee in a cafe, and we were talking, and this man comes up behind us, and I recognized him as looking very different from the stereotypical Latvian. He had dark skin, dark hair. He was kind of a smaller frame, and he was wearing a tracksuit and tennis shoes and looking a little disheveled. And he didn't say anything. He didn't interrupt us as we were speaking. He was just standing right behind Juris. And I said to Juris, gee, I didn't realize there was a Roma population in Riga. And Juris does not look at the man. He just says, there are no Roma in Latvia as such. They do not exist to us as people. And what I remembered, you know, of course, he was wrong in the literal sense. Of course they exist. Here's a man standing right behind us. But in the metaphoric sense, he's quite correct. In Latvia, the Roma are rarely recognized as being real people, and as having the same kind of standing as real Latvians. And I thought the finality in his voice kind of indicated to me there's something more here, something to be discovered. And so that's kind of how I started getting more interested in the Roma and wanting to dig a little bit further. And on another trip then, I did actually meet with a Roma family who lived kind of in the woods, and the way that they made their living was the grandmother, who was quite elderly, worked in a tinning factory where they tinned sprats. And we went and we visited, and with the aid of an interpreter, a couple of interpreters, we needed somebody who spoke both Latvian and Romani, and then another one who knew Latvian and English. So it was a little bit like playing the telephone game. We never always knew for sure if we were getting things exactly right, but what struck me was the hospitality of this grandmother, who insisted on sharing everything that they had, and in this case it was 3 packets of sugar. And that really stuck with me, and I thought, I want to come back. I want to come back again and again. I want to establish relationships with these people that go beyond just a mere researcher taking notes, because I think I found something interesting. During that time, in one of these visits, the grandmother told a story of going out into the forest to pick berries. She went by herself as a girl. When she came back, the entire village was gone. Every person in the village had been taken. She learned years later what happened to them, had been taken, put on lorries, driven to a train station, never to be seen again. And that was the first time I heard that Roma experienced the same fate as so many Jews did in Europe. It had never occurred to me that this might happen to other people groups. I'd only heard of the Holocaust, had not heard of what the Roma called the Great Devouring. So again, it was one of those, moments. This is something I want to keep finding out more about. And I sat spellbound as she told me this story, because I have to confess, I was realizing that the narrative that she was sharing with me and what I was seeing, this hospitality, sharing everything that she had with me, didn't match up with the narratives and the visual imaging that I thought I would see. My understanding of the Roma, or the Gypsies, were and had been entirely shaped by a cultural myth, that of my families and people around us, and images presented in film and other art forms. And I realized, I think I'm a walking reliquary of misinformation, actually. I think I house within me this idea, a very caricaturized and stereotypical idea of who the Roma might be. And I realized, though, it wasn't entirely my fault. I'll come back to that. It's not entirely my fault, because I had a grandmother who told me, gypsies ride around in caravans and keep horses. Gypsies dress like this. If you're a young man, you should watch out, because they're very seductive. Gypsies gaze into crystal balls and will tell you your future, or they might steal your children, or they might rob you blind. This is all courtesy of my grandmother, by the way. The problem with these statements and the accompanying imagery is that very little of it bears any resemblance to reality. I have a few items sitting on the second table back. One of them is the children's picture book. It has a man playing a violin. That's another typical image associated with the Roma. There's kind of like a red label that has a woman dancing, and I think her midriff is exposed. Another very stereotypical image of Roma, it happens to be a canning label for a can of tuna. Now, how did this Roma woman end up on a packing label for a tinning company in Astoria? And I'll tell you, the answer is because they didn't want the cans, if they're starting to rust, they don't want people to see the rust, so they have to have red labels to cover it. And, you know, red, of course, just is naturally associated with the Roma, right? So yeah, it boggles the mind, doesn't it? So I found out, too, though, that not only was my grandmother incorrect, but so, too, some of the armchair ethnologists and people who would call themselves gypsyologists. One of them, named Konrad Berkovici, writes in his book, The Story of the Gypsies, published in about 1920, sometime in the dark long ago, the ancestors of the Gypsies undoubtedly experimented with the futility of possessions and groaned under the heavy load. Behind them, thousands and thousands of years behind them, are the ashes of a civilization and a culture which, when the flame was blown out, demonstrated the falseness of its root flower. Duty and possession limit the emotional capacity of civilized man. There are the boundaries beyond which he cannot go. He must encompass his happiness within the limits of what he must have and what he owns. Now, Berkovici was not a linguist. He never lived with the Roma, didn't learn the Romany language or any of its dialects. But he contends those merry wanderers, the Gypsies, travel hither and yon, carefree, unfettered by all that mires those of us stuck in a workaday world. He writes, there's more joy and more happiness, there's more poetry and deep emotion in a gypsy camp of 3 ragged tents than in the largest city of the civilized world. Now, his effusive praise suggests a couple of things. Perhaps his interpretation as to why the Roma maybe don't have a lot of possessions, and it's an interesting theory that he's got there, but it also suggests his longing not only to study the Roma, but perhaps to become one of them. He's not alone. Others of that era wrote eloquently of the untrammeled freedom of the Gypsies, and while much of this commentary is informed by a romantic spirit, I think of genuine curiosity and admiration and evident enchantment. Theirs was an idealized and an exoticized presentation, and thus a skewed understanding or presentation of the Roma. But so too are other accounts, discussing the Roma as if they were to be scrutinized beneath a microscope or from the confines of a petri dish. Sort of a peculiar species, foreign to the observer and therefore suspect. For example, Angus Fraser, in his book, The Gypsies, notes the earliest record of the Romany in Europe, and bear in mind, this is written by a non-Roma observer. In the course of the year 1417, there appeared in Germany a horde of men, sunburned, dressed in rags of fall colors, followed by a still greater number of women, dressed even more immodestly than the men, who thronged the roads and invaded vociferously the homes of people, spreading terror everywhere and begging and stealing everything they saw. When questioned, the strangers claimed they had hailed from Lower Egypt and that they had been condemned to a 7-year exile to atone for a sin committed by their ancestors, who had refused to accept the Virgin Mary and her Holy Son at the time of their flight from Egypt. So great was the superstition these strangers awakened in the German peasants, and so intense the fear, that they considered it a crime to do violence to the gypsies and left them to steal, rob, and cheat without hindrance. Now, there are other accounts, some of them even less flattering, but the point I take from some of these accounts written at the turn of the 20th century is that the Roma elicited attention everywhere they went for several reasons. And one of them is that they did, in fact, dress differently. They spoke an unrecognizable language. Their physical appearance was unlike anything the local population had seen. And here's where it really gets interesting. They expressed little to no interest in settling permanently or engaging in the work that the locals did. They did not want to cultivate the land. They did not want to become peasants. They wanted to make a living, but they did not want to live as others did. They wanted acceptance, but not assimilation, and for this, the local population could not forgive them. Now, neither the Romantic nor the ethnocentric presentation of the Roma is limited to such pseudo-academic tomes. My very first encounter with the Roma was by way of a James Bond film called From Russia with Love. Anybody seen that one? Yeah. This takes me back. That was the third one? Okay. Yeah. Oh, well, there's a great scene in there, in which there's a fight at a gypsy camp amongst two women who are dueling over they're both in love with the same guy. So the British secret agent James Bond has been invited to this camp outside of Istanbul, and during the meal with his host, a fight breaks out. And the scene is utterly vicious. I mean, these women are going at it. They are tearing each other's hair. They're biting, they're kicking, they're gonna scratch each other's eyes out. They're fighting to the death. And it strikes the suave and urbane and savvy Bond as savage. Women fall all over Bond, but they don't fight to the death in front of him. And so at one point, the host asks is there anything that he would like, and he says, yes, stop the girl fight. And the host reluctantly complies, and predictably, one of the women then fawns all over Bond. I know, it's a Bond movie, what do you expect? So as a 7-year-old, I sat entranced by this scene, these people around the campfire, the wooden caravans, the horses, the music, the boisterous festivities. And it seemed to me this is a world governed by a different set of rules and customs, and therefore a closed world wrapped in an air of mystery. But again, the only trouble is a lot of the representations there were inaccurate. And so I began to wonder a few years ago, after that trip to Latvia in 2008, I began to wonder, well, then who are the Roma? And if what I thought about them isn't accurate, or these aren't accurate representations, well, then what are? And so that began to fuel a whole lot of travel, a whole lot of research. A whole lot of research. And I began to see, that their history is really quite rich, quite dense, and very complicated. And so to understand who they are, I had to really hit the history books. And here, again, there's quite a lot of misrepresentation. I have this slide here because if anyone is interested in running down some of these sources, I highly recommend this book written by Isabel Fonseca, bury me standing. Bury me standing is like a Roma phrase, meaning I will fight until I can't stand up anymore. And if I die, don't bury me flat, because that's a position of defeat. And we're not defeated people. So anyways, where do the Roma come from? Well, according to non-Roma, the legendary says that they are cursed descendants of Cain. The texts of Genesis in particular, a theorist, again, we're talking about people writing about the Roma in the 1900s, and they themselves are not Roma, emphasize the curse put on the brother of Abel, and quite rightly evoking the birth of a nomad people driven by unfavorable winds of fate. Genesis specifies the occupations to which the son of Cain were to be condemned. Trades, which this author reminds us are specific to the Roma. Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Another bit of legendary, and this one is from Homer. Who says, Vulcan was one day hurled down from the sky by his father Zeus, who was angry with him. During a whole day, said Vulcan, I rolled about in the winds, and when the sun went down, I fell on the island of Limnus, and there the Sinti, the Gypsies, picked me up. Now, legendary in India, for the most part, was reserved to talking about individuals who lived on the fringe of society, nomads and outcasts, who were both feared and despised. In India, as elsewhere, a whole mythology links together workers in iron and various categories of giants and demons. They're all enemies of the gods. Mircea Eliade talks about this in some of his work, that the stressing of curses attached to wandering people and curses attached to people who work in the subterranean world, who dig in the bowels of the earth, and then the connections between wandering and working with working in trades that have to do with smithing, metal smithing, copper smithing. So, again, these are all legends and myths, associations, and connections sort of cooked up by people who are not themselves Roma. So what do the Roma say about themselves? Where do they say they come from? Well, one host in Bulgaria said his theory is that there were 2 large groups of Roma who left northern India to join Alexander the Great's army. And he says one group acted as the hired warriors. They were the upper class, and the lower caste group, the lower class, carried the luggage and would have, been manning the mobile forges and, shoeing horses and whatnot. So this is the legendary. These are the theories offered by people. But the greatest indicator, or the best indicator, it seems, comes from the linguists. And here's where Ian Hancock and Angus Fraser have done a lot of legwork. And Fraser says the real breakthrough in trying to figure out where did these people actually come from, who are they really, where did they come from, came in the 18th century by chance when a Hungarian student at the University of Leiden came across 3 students from southwest India. He noted the resemblance between their language and that of the language spoken by the Roma in his hometown in Hungary. And he drew up a vocabulary with them, which he was later able to discuss at length with other Roma. And linguists at once followed the trail. There were linguists in Germany and elsewhere, Transylvania, and other linguists in Hungary, and they began to start piecing together this map built of language. And they were noting how certain loanwords and certain words were acquired at a particular time. And they were able to piece together. Here's where they really came from, northern India. Now, this is all kind of esoteric stuff for me. I don't fully get it. It's pretty cerebral. But as a person who likes to work with words, I think it's really cool that an entire people group could be traced, kind of like these little GPS markers in language itself. I find that very exciting. But language has been kind of tricky for the Roma. I've been using the word gypsy and Roma interchangeably, and that's really kind of a no-no because gypsy is not the name that they chose for themselves, although I have heard many Roma refer to themselves as gypsy. And we'll get to that, why they might do that a little bit later, I hope. But I want to talk, just kind of hit the pause button and talk about this whole naming thing. What is in a name? So the meaning attached to the term gypsy, and again, it's not the name they chose for themselves, which is a term most commonly used to designate the Roma, contains within it a semantic core, a problem not of the Roma's making. The word gypsy, which sounds very much like the word Egyptian, actually derives from the Greek word atsagane, which this is what Byzantine Christians called the Roma when they first made contact with them. And atsagane means unclean and also carries an alternative pejorative suggestion of one who traffics in sorcery and the occult. Christians were not allowed to do business with atsagane, and over time the term shortened to tsigane, chigane, chigan in the Balkans, zigun and ziguner in Germany, chigan, gitan, gitano in Spain, and gypsy in UK, Wales, elsewhere, United States. And again, these are terms applied to them, not of their own choosing. As one man said to me in Serbia, we want our own name. Because a name is so important to identity. We are Roma, and that's what we call ourselves. It's the name we chose for ourselves. So Rom designates a man, it's singular. Romni is singular for woman. I've also heard Roma for woman, singular. I've heard Romani and Roma for Roma, plural. So what do they call non-Roma? Gaje and gajo, and for them, that is the word for unclean. It's the unclean outsider. Isn't that perfect? So recently I met with a young woman named Melody Waxmuth, a researcher living in Croatia, and she spent the last 6 years studying Roma culture in Serbia and Croatia, and she attested it's really, whatever they call themselves or other people call them, it's important to remember that they are not a monolithic group, and that the use of different ethonyms can lead to confusion for those unfamiliar with the Roma groups. For example, there are groups who identify as Roma. There are others that call themselves Romani. There are some groups that say, no, call us Gypsy. That's what we call ourselves. There are others who call themselves, especially in UK, travelers, and in the Netherlands, Germany, and in Belgium, some identify as Sinti. So I'm using during this talk the terms Roma and Romani in the broadest sense to describe the group of people who may speak one of the Romani dialects. They may have a shared experience and sense of history, cultural practice, and or self-identify as Roma, Romani, or Gypsy. It would be a mistake, I think, though, for me to think about the Roma as a unified group who share a common language or common culture, because from group to group, the culture can be quite different. Although I did notice there were some patterns, there were some things in areas in which there were places of commonality and links, and I found that just wildly fascinating. One point of commonality is that everywhere I went, somebody had a story of grave persecution. Somebody had a knowledge of history in their family in which people were very badly treated. And I think, if we take into account this whole naming thing, atsagane, unclean, person who deals with sorcery, a person we're not allowed to talk to, it kind of makes sense then that the non-Roma who encountered them would have a negative view of these new visitors, and that might inform how they got along. The fact is that the relations between Roma and non-Roma have never been peaceful. They've always been quite troubled. From the time they arrived in Western Europe in the late 1830s and into the 1400s, the Roma were viewed as intruders whose presence disrupted an order society. Again, they wanted to be there, they wanted to live and work, but they did not want to do so as the others did. They did not want to be assimilated, and that caused problems. They refused to settle and integrate, and that refusal aroused fear and suspicion and distrust. One of the most universally adopted policies taken by various governments was to expel the Roma from the country. In Germany and the Netherlands, those who failed to comply were hanged if they were male, and they were flogged if they were female. When the Gypsies, the Romani, appeared in the Netherlands in 1420, they were called Heiden, or pagans, or Egyptians, and they were quickly rejected and scorned as to be considered no more than parasites and foreign vagabonds of the worst sort, people with no rights at all, the killing of whom was seen as a boon to society. Gypsy hunts were not uncommon, and in many regions, the sound of an alarm bell signaled open season, open hunting on the women, men, and children, firearms being used in the event of resistance. And bounties were paid to those most skilled at capturing, another term, Bohemians, or the Romani, dead or alive, and the profession of the bounty hunter arose. In 1525, I'm sorry, I have to do a little bit of history. It will lay the groundwork for what's coming later. In 1525, Charles V, also known as Charles I of Spain, issued an edict in Holland ordering all those who called themselves Egyptians to leave the country in 2 days. Those who didn't had their possessions seized and suffered long prison sentences, whipping, and branding. And so it goes in what is now the Czech Republic, Poland, and other areas, in which those who stayed after they were ordered to leave might have an ear cut off the first time they were caught, the second time they were caught, a hand cut off, and then the third time they would be killed. Farther east, traveling now towards what is now Romania and Moldova, the Romani weren't killed outright, but were often enslaved from the early 1400s until 1856. They were chained by hand, foot, or even by the neck, and they would be hung over smoke as a punishment or thrown into icy rivers or snow. Women were separated from husbands, and children sold off and scattered throughout the country. Sometimes they would be exchanged between princes and other nobles as gifts. It was specified that every gypsy was automatically born a slave, and that the child of a gypsy slave was also a slave. And on this goes. And given this kind of treatment of the Roma and the attitude toward the Roma that they aren't quite real people, they're sort of a subspecies, they can be bought and sold, they are the source of all of our troubles, it's not very surprising that in Germany, excuse me, I find this here. In Germany, there were edicts designed to separate the Romani from the other population, so the appearance of some of the first ghetto-type encampments. The Romani, if we fast forward in the 20th century, the Romani in Central and Western Europe were persecuted a little less severely, but the general attitude that these people are intruders still remained. They were seen as pests against which society had to defend itself with unrelenting vigilance. They had to register with authorities if they were entering or leaving a city or a country. A law in 1928 in Germany placed the Romani under permanent police surveillance. The prime prohibition directed against the Romani was usually residence, hence banishment as a punishment. But nomadism itself was punished. So they were punished if they stayed. They were punished if they took to the road and tried to travel, whether to flee or relocate. There was a ban of moving about in groups of more than 3 or 4 people. So then, if you start to think about it, ultimately, the thing that they're being punished for is their very existence. Now, living amidst a dominant culture in which they were viewed as the source of all trouble, it isn't surprising then by the 30s that the Nazi regime would seek to exterminate them down to the last child. And because they were considered socially inferior, being of inferior genetic stock, although they spoke an Indo-European language, they were considered socially dangerous. In 1938, a law was passed to counter the Gypsy threat, and deportations and rounding folks up and sending them to camps was then part of a normal routine at that time. Many were sent to Auschwitz, and the exact figures, and it's interesting, there aren't precise figures for how many Roma were killed. So I don't know, it's tricky, and there is sort of this taboo against talking about the Great Devouring because it's bad luck to talk about bad things. So it's very difficult to gather accurate data. Another thing is during the 30s and the 40s, researchers, ethnologists, anthropologists enlisted by the Nazis to gather data. Were doing so that they could accurately determine who was Roma so as to exterminate them. So there is a natural distrust you can imagine that the Roma have for anybody arriving with a notebook and a clipboard and a pencil asking questions. So at any point, there were many stories I heard about people fleeing from the Nazis, having to change their identity, throwing all of their identity papers, anything that indicated who they might be in a river, totally leaving any trace of their former life, and then trying to be something else, anything else, trying to be Serbian, Italian, anything, so as to not be caught. But as people told these stories, what stuck with me was not, I never picked up on any kind of sense of bitterness or anger. What struck me, and I think this is really what was so sad, was the resignation in which these stories were told, as if, well, this is who we are, and this is how we're always treated, and how we will always be treated. Which brings us to discrimination in education, and I'll try to be brief so that we have some time for questions before our break. This is an advertisement for a slave auction of gypsies in Romania. So discrimination is leveled against the Roma, starts at a pretty early age for them. One woman told me her story. She was a primary school teacher, and this is very interesting that she herself, during the 60s, 50s and 60s, was a teacher, but only for Roma children. Because she was Roma, she was never allowed to teach non-Roma. But she said discrimination starts very young. She told me a story of how she managed to arrange for a field trip for her students. This is in Bulgaria. And they stopped to get some food, and they sat down at a table to eat it. And the kids were speaking their Romani dialect. And some Bulgarians who were sitting at a table nearby commented to her and said, "Gee, your kids are so dirty. And they're speaking a dirty language. Why do you let them do that?" And she said to me, "Yes, Bulgarians still see us that way, even though it's 2017. They think of us as lower people, and they think of us as stupid people." And part of the reason why, she was explaining to me, is that the Roma in Bulgaria typically leave school between the 4th and 6th grades. And this was a common story, not just in Bulgaria. In Tolcha, a city in Romania near the Black Sea, the girls, I'm told, quit school at around age 12 or 13 when they're able to marry and have children. The director of the middle school in Tolcha lamented that it just seemed to be the Gypsy way to come to school for a few weeks and then disappear. And now none of the Romanian families want to send their kids here. We're known as the Gypsy school. We're the bad school. In Latvia and Moldova, I heard the same story. Kids don't stay in school for long, and when they do, they go sporadically. One man living in Latvia explained to me that the Roma don't view education as entirely necessary. So sometimes the discouragement to go to school comes from within the family unit itself. For the Roma, it's more important to teach children how to work, to collect berries, firewood, draw water. And if a child doesn't do well in the 1st grade, the teacher dismisses them. You get one shot in the 1st grade. If you don't do well, you're done. That's the end of your education. So I asked different people, different countries, why might Roma children have such a difficult time in the first grade? After all, I'm watching these kids scamper around and play, and they look intelligent. They look as intelligent as any other children, and many of them already at age 4 and 5 are speaking multiple languages. So surely that would serve them well in the classroom. And I was told, well, there are lots of reasons why they don't do well in the classroom, and a lot of it has to do with the education style, the style of teaching, and the style that the Roma have of learning. The Roma learn by seeing and experiencing. For Bulgarians, for example, they learn by writing and reading. And a pervasive and not too subtle air of discrimination within the classroom only exacerbates the situation for a Roma learner. My host, Radko, who was a student during the 1980s in Bulgaria, said, "I felt shamed by everything in my life. Everywhere I went, I felt shame because I'm Roma. In school, there were 10 Roma in my class, and the teachers put us in the seats in the back row. If I asked my math teacher a question, he'd hit me in the back of the head and tell me I was a stupid boy. But if a Bulgarian student asked the same question, the teacher would come to his or her desk and patiently explain the problem and how to arrive at the correct solution. This happened so many times that after a while, I stopped asking questions. I began to believe that I was a stupid boy." Radko says even his skin was a source of shame. People avoided him because of his darker skin, which signaled he might be Roma. And even now, despite his many years of teaching and participating with distinction at conferences, Radko notes that people still avoid him. "So I have to remind myself of my identity. I'm Roma, but I'm not second class." What about the next generation, his own daughters? I asked him, and he sighed, a very heavy, ponderous sigh, and he said, "My 11-year-old, she's starting to feel ashamed of being Roma. I can see it." In Jagodina, Serbia, I heard the same stories. Miki Kamberovic there directs an all-Roma kindergarten designed to prepare Roma children for a successful first grade. And he describes his experience in school, in which he said that teachers routinely gave unfair marks to Roma students so that those kids would not pass exams, and so that they would be passed over for scholarships and other kinds of opportunities. He too would be beaten by the teacher, whether he answered something correctly or incorrectly. The fact that he was Roma and dared raise his voice was enough to earn a whack on the back of the head, or worse. But his sheer unyielding willpower, and I think really his brilliance, helped him beat the odds, and he graduated from high school and went on to university, and now he's made it his mission to educate young Roma. That's his priority, because in Serbia, children cannot enter the first grade unless they have in hand a certificate that says they have been successfully prepared for the first grade, which means they have to go to kindergarten. But most Roma families don't send their kids to kindergarten. So he's designed the school specifically to do that. Without that certificate from an approved scholastic center stating that these basic requirements have been met, children cannot enter. And once they do enter, again, it's just like in Latvia, they get one chance to succeed in the first grade. If they cannot do the basic requirements for first grade, they're sent home, and that is it for their educational career. No extra chances. So he's decided it is absolutely, education will absolutely change the lives of these Roma people, these Roma kids. But still, with all of the things in his arsenal, his intellect, his energy, his willpower, even he still fights discrimination. Even his kids have met it in the classroom. Okay, so I'll stop there for questions. I think, how long do we have for questions? 10 minutes, and then we have a break. Okay, so I hope you have some questions for me. Yes. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Franca, And my question is, the readings that I've done on nomads, and I'll just use a more broader term, is that the horse is a really significant cultural piece to their culture. So you don't mention that, or is that something you're going to talk about? Or did you encounter that at all?
Did you say, I want
The
to make sure.
horse, the horse.
The
Yeah.
animal, the horse.
Yeah, they're very attached to the horse as a cultural part of their, of their culture.
Right. I have read that too, that the horse is really an essential piece, kind of Roma identity. And great deference is paid for the horse. They won't eat horse meat, for example. And having a good horse, it's like having a great car. I mean, you just take really good care of your animals, particularly the horse. I met with and spoke with mostly urbanized Roma who may have at one time traveled by caravan and would have had horses, but everyone I met with at this point in time, they were settled and had been settled, and I think a lot of that had to do in the countries I was visiting, they would have been communist countries at one point in which people were forced to settle. So a lot of that nomadic movement, it had to take a different form. It had to start looking different. So I didn't hear a lot about horses, but I do think you are correct. They are very, and were very important to the culture. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, this is Paul over here. Just a couple observations. One, there was a documentary film put out a few years ago on a tour of gypsy musicians in the United States, and one was from northern India, one group was from northern India, one from Macedonia, one from Spain, and one other group. And just the interaction of these musicians during the tour was kind of an education right there, and they all talked through music. And then the other comment I have, my ex-wife was a dental hygienist in Santa Rosa, California, and her practice was sort of known as the practice that the Gypsies went to, or the Roma. And these people were the ones that ran the palm reading things, which this is back in the 70s and the 80s. But she said they were always respectful, always quiet. They had lots of gold in their mouth and on their person, and they always paid with cash.
That sounds about right. Yeah, and I think there's a reason why the gold in the mouth, and I'm hoping I won't run. I'm hoping I will be succinct and cogent, and we'll get to it. But for a Roma person, the body is divided into halves. Anything above the waist is considered clean and good and pure. Anything below, impure. So if you have wealth, if you have gold, silver, perfectly acceptable to tuck it into your bra, totally acceptable for your husband or family member to help themselves and reach in there, because this part of the body, it's okay. It's okay for it to be seen. Gold in the mouth, perfectly great place to put it. The mouth is clean, spittle is clean, vomit is clean. What's not clean is anything that happens below. Yeah.
When I was a child back east, the gypsies were there occasionally, and we were told to avoid them because they stole little children and we would never be seen again. So every time I saw someone who was a gypsy, I would just stay close to my parents.
Yeah, that is an enduring cultural piece of mythology. I heard it in my family. I trotted it past some folks in Leskovac, Serbia. I was at a cultural center for the Roma, and I said, here's something that people sometimes say in the United States, non-Roma. I said that they steal your children. And the men laughed so hard, they could not contain themselves. I mean, the laughter just like shook the walls. They're like, we have so many children, why would we want more? Kids are expensive. Yeah.
Hi, this is Ingrid. You did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people. Thank you very much for that. But here's my question. In talking to so many people, is there, in your opinion, a chance that they can get some less prejudiced teachers for those children so that they will have a better chance to learn something?
I think it's starting to happen. It takes somebody like Mickey with a lot of energy and someone and a little bit in your face. When there's prejudice in the classroom, he goes and he confronts the teacher, the director, the person who's above the director, and he's reported to me he's actually seen teachers apologize, not just to the Roma student they offended, but also to the entire class. He told me this story. A teacher said, "Kids, I did something really awful. I called Peter a chigan. I thought it was a funny joke. I thought Peter would know I was joking, but it was offensive to him. And the worst thing, kids, is I demonstrated to you that it's okay to use this word and it's okay to tell jokes like that." So there is change. There are sensitive people, but it's change happens at the margins. It's one person at a time, one teacher at a time, one director at a time. But I do think that it is changing, but it takes, a willingness to be changed. Yeah.
Hi, this is Vernell. I'm done. Right here.
Hi.
Hi. In all of your travels and you growing up here in this area, do you see a correlation between what we experience in this country with our discriminations that are so blatant and what you see in Europe with the Roma?
Yeah, I really do. There is a strong correlation. I do see it. And unfortunately, it's what a dominant group does to, the subordinate groups. And until, I do see it. I do see it. Yeah, and I was asked about that. Hey, why are you coming here and asking us questions? You got your own problems. What's going on in the South? How are you treating people in Oregon? What about your migrant workers? I mean, these people are aware of some things going on in other places, so they would kind of turn the questions back to me, and it is very uncomfortable to say, yep, we have all the same problems. It might manifest slightly differently, but it's still there, definitely there.
Hi, Gina. I really appreciate this talk. My grandmother and father are from Serbia, and my grandmother, I remember, it's too bad I didn't ask her these questions before, but I never heard her discuss or ever talk about the Roma people. This is so new to me. I remember her being very closed about her past, and we couldn't really discuss her, her past at all, which was really unfortunate. But so I don't know, were they not discussed? I would say to her, I loved the Gypsy music, and I loved the Serbian music and the Hungarian music, and I asked her one time if she would consider herself a Gypsy, and she was really insulted by that.
Oh, yes. That doesn't surprise me.
I was enamored with the Gypsies as a kid.
Yeah, and that was something I ran into a little bit too. The biggest insult, worst insult you could call anybody in Bulgaria, for example, is to confuse them with a Roma. And there were Bulgarian folks who looked very much like they could have been, dressing the same way, similar hairstyle. Really, they could have been, and it would have been highly insulting because Roma are clearly in the Bulgarian mind, the Serbian mind, Croatian mindset, they are a subspecies. We can't even consider them as being, people we would even acknowledge that they exist. As my friend in Latvia told me, they do not exist as such as people. And it's, it adds to that veil of invisibility. It's hard to see them if you're told they don't exist, hard to see them if they've learned that they don't have a voice, so they don't use it. Yeah, they sometimes have willingly played along with the invisibility. Yes.
Hi, this is Ken.
Thank you.
Now that the Roma have more or less settled down, whether by force or not, and the nomadic lifestyle is probably not really practical in Europe, are they showing any signs of assimilation?
Interesting. Not so much. And this is a very interesting, I think, kind of like an ethnological phenomena. How is it that they can be settled but not assimilated, and they have no distinct unifying language, in the sense that a Roma person speaking Romani in Latvia may or may not be understood by a Roma person speaking Romani in Bulgaria. And they can have that very distinct culture. And I was told many times, by Roma groups, the Kalaji, for example, in central Bulgaria, we are the true Roma, best gypsies. Everybody else, they're fakes. So each group contends that they're the best, they're the purest, and they don't unify. They have no political, economic, religious spheres where they unify.
Hi, this is Lester. Just as an aside, my mother came from Slovakia, and she always said she was part Gypsy, and she had this little group of females who would come every month or maybe every week, and she would read tea leaves for them. And they all swore that she really could foretell the future. Now, I don't believe she was any part Gypsy based on where she came from and so forth, but she thought that was a great thing to be.
Yeah.
But yes, one of the issues I saw was that they've transitioned. I saw this in Switzerland and other places. The caravans now are motorized caravans, and they either have RVs or trailers or so forth. I've never seen a group that were using horses, but in Switzerland, for example, they're only allowed to stay in one place for a specific period of time and then must move. So assimilation or integration is really not possible, nor could they go to the same school for any period of time. So I think there's a basic governmental as well as societal stigma of being Roma.
Yeah, absolutely would agree. But they're very flexible people, so maybe not using the horse and caravan, but they're caravanning in other ways. But yes, it's very difficult to get a quality education if you're always on the move because you're not allowed to stay. Yeah, it's as if their very existence is the thing that they're being punished for.
I am Hans. This goes back a little ways. I worked at Salem Hospital, then we worked nights there also at times. This is in the 60s. There was quite a group of people that just populated the second floor where the laboratory happened to be, and they were immovable. One of the patients, well, the nurses said, oh, he is some kind of a prince, and we just tried to work around them. That was 24 hours a day. He was there for several days, but everybody knew where they were.
This is very typical Roma behavior. When somebody goes to the hospital, the entire family, extended family, friends will go to the hospital too, because you never want to leave a sick person alone. And if it's a serious illness and they could possibly die, they shouldn't be left alone. So they're there to make sure that he is not contaminated by outsiders. A nurse, a doctor is a respected person to the Roma, but also they're a source of contagion and contamination. So, the medicine itself could be a source of contamination. So they've got to make sure, and they're really probably watching carefully the food that this person was being fed. But their presence is important, that they come out in numbers like that, particularly in hospitals, just to make sure everything is okay and that their family members being well attended to, and also that everyone knows that they're there.
Thanks. Boy, it's pretty clear that there's tremendous interest in your presentation. So we'll take 10 and hope that there'll be time for questions another time. Thank you.
Are we good now? Okay. Well, so thank you for your questions and observations. I think I want to reserve some more time at the end because I think we have more. So I'll try to move more quickly through some of these things. But one of the areas where I saw some pattern, some similarity emerging between the different Roma groups that I was talking to were their attitudes toward work and some of the occupations that they would engage in. I have a kind of an old vintage photo on the second table back. It shows one kind of occupation that a particular group of Roma in Moldova and Romania are particularly well known, and I'll talk about that. But generally speaking, and this may be, again, a little bit of a cultural misinformation that I brought with me when I went on my first trips. I thought, well, all Roma, generally speaking, must have some skill with metalworking. Now, I did not know about Homer's account and had not read anything that Mircea Eliade had written, but I just somehow thought, oh, this is what they do. And while it was actually true in several places, that I would, in the Roma villages, and the Roma tended to live separately from their non-Roma neighbors, usually by about 5 to 10 kilometers away, they would group themselves, and I would see things like this. I would see very intricate work on rain flashings and on roofs and elaborate weather vanes, all kinds of bling, I guess, added to their fences and fence posts and even well covers. And it was clear that these folks at one time, were very good at the fashioning metal. It became clear to me that the Roma can do so much more. And as I traveled about in Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria, I discovered as their demand in these kinds of skills was on the wane, they had to become very flexible and learn how to do other things. And so, namely, they had to become versatile in the art of collecting and redistributing, and we can define that very loosely. In Bucharest, on busy street corners, I would see Roma women hunkered over the curbs, slips of papers in their hand. Tax season was approaching, and they would sell these for those who wanted extra documentation. There is a heaven for those little slips of paper. Children would be going through trash bins looking for cardboard and metal. And outside, on the city outskirts, I would see women and children by intersections selling hallets of berries. But by no means were these the only ways in which the Roma exhibited flexibility and a keen understanding of consumer trends. Recently, on the last trip in Jagodina, I met a man named Zhika who was sitting in an outdoor market with his parents, phalanxes of cell phones and watches stretched out before him on a cardboard table. And he said, well, I find them broken and I fix them. Sure, the glass faces have cracks, but they all work. And he assured me that he told me, and there was no mistaking the pride in his voice. And he said on a good day, he can make 30 euros selling these phones that he says they really do work. And as I spoke with different Roma groups, I saw, too, that there's a pattern emerging between acceptable forms of employment or work and also a difference between men's work and women's work. For example, men's work, amongst the Kalaji, a very kind of isolated insular group living in central Bulgaria, I visited with, and this would have been a traditional trade that father would have passed down to son, the art of making huge copper pots. Kalaji in Romani means coppersmith. So they would have made these huge kind of copper pots for distilling spirits, but also smaller pots and pans. But it's a vanishing art, and he was Stefan there on the far left is the coppersmith, and he said, it's a fine art, and it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of skill and a lot of detailed work, and therefore it is vanishing. And he said, now everybody just wants to buy cheap crap from China. And his son's not pictured there, but I said, well, surely, Nasko, your son will because Nasko knows how to do this too. I said, surely he'll want to take over the family business. And he said, oh, why bother? Nasko's got his own business. He goes around the countryside collecting broken engine parts and carburetors and fixing them and then reselling them, to the same farmer who had that rotting tractor in their field. And I thought, yes, collecting and redistributing. And he's doing quite well at it. This is outside of Volkanesht, another example again of that kind of fine attention to detail with the metalworking of the fence, and a good example of women's work. So while the men are out there gathering, collecting, selling, trading, The women are in charge of the more quotidian, the domestic work inside the house. So they would be drawing water. In a lot of the villages, no running water, but there is a communal well. And so they would be the ones getting the water. They'd be the ones doing laundry. This is how you do laundry. They would be the ones in charge of obtaining the food, cleaning the food, cooking the food, serving it, and making sure all of the serving utensils were properly sanitized afterwards. Keeping utensils utterly clean and separated from anything else so that something that's tainted or unclean isn't touching it is of vital importance inside the house. For example, if she's doing laundry, you can be sure any kind of intimate garment is not mixed in with a non-intimate garment, and that's all part of upper body, lower body, keeping things separate and clean at all times. The wash water has to be disposed of in a particular way, particularly if it's wash water that was used in the cleaning of an intimate item. It cannot be, it just has to be disposed of in very particular ways. And when I was staying with the family, I had a young boy. It was just so shameful to send the young girl because of some of the things I was doing. They had to send the young boy to tell me that I was brushing my teeth incorrectly and the way that I was spitting what do you call that? your spittle. The way that I was doing that was wrong. And just all of the cleanliness rules, I realized it really does dominate the way people are thinking and how they interact in their world. And typically, it's the females in the household who are in charge of making sure things stay pure. And purity was a topic that came up so often. I'm jumping backwards to work. So in Moldova, I met with a group of people who are called the Ursari, Ursa bear, and they would have been the bear leaders, bear trainers of the day. Now, they would have done this up until about 70 or 80 years ago. At that time, it became less popular to have traveling circuses, a lot harder to travel, again, because of some forced settlement policies under the communist era. In Romania, which was not a good place to be a Roma, by the way. But this particular group of people were very interesting to me because they were literate. They all could read in this one tiny village of about 80 people. Everybody, including the women, could read. And while everyone else around them was Orthodox Romanian, these folks were Baptists. And I found that just highly interesting. And I wondered how this occurred and if it had anything to do with their previous work, if in their travels they came across somebody who taught them to read Romanian. Now they are active in this particular village. Speaking of work, they are very active in transcribing New Testament passages in Romanian into their Romani dialect and doing it in a written form and also audio CD to share with others. And this is the only group that I found that seemed to be interested in the roots of their language and in actively codifying and preserving their own stories. So it's a group I plan to go and visit again because they seem to be pretty receptive to what I'm trying to do with storytelling. But I do find their history here quite interesting. And I think, please do note that the woman is smiling. She is happy to have that 200-pound bear sitting on her back. So I want to talk a little bit about purity, and I'll try to move quickly. I think because we've talked about upper body, lower body, and taboo and marime type things regarding taboo, the idea that purity is important was stressed from group to group. Whether I was in Latvia or Serbia or Bulgaria, it didn't matter where I went. The topic of purity came up. It was just assumed that I was impure because I was a gajo. And because I didn't know their rules, the assumption was I was very impure, and I would often be served with different utensils and on a different plate. Even though I was considered a guest of honor and they treated me with incredible generosity, it was assumed that I was a source of contagion. And so, little kids did not come up and hug me, and that was okay. But the idea that a person has to remain pure at all times, and the things that they have to do if they accidentally should become impure were quite exhaustive. To add to our complication, because talking about purity and impurity is itself a taboo, we had to walk very delicately around this, and again, often with several translators. But at no time is purity more important when we're thinking about marrying off our youngsters. So with the College group, and there's about 18 to 20,000 of them living in central Bulgaria. And one day we were invited to a birthday party, and this is Anka in the red. She invited us to a birthday party, and she said, "Hey, come watch us sell a bride. Maybe we'll be famous in America." And so we get there to this informal bridal market, and the idea amongst the College is that they arrange marriages and they will sell their daughters for a bride price. And often sometimes this will come under scrutiny from non-Roma community in Bulgaria. And recently a documentary called Broadly focused on the bride market of Stara Zagora, which was about 10 kilometers of where we're at here. And in the documentary, the female interviewer met with several girls as they prepared for their big day. And the College families from all over central Bulgaria will come and were likely to attend. And this female interviewer asked these girls repeatedly what they thought about the idea of being sold off to another family. And the manner in which she asked the question suggested she had her own idea about how the girls might be feeling, and namely that they were repressed and they were being treated like objects and like chattel. Don't you want to pursue your own happiness, your own fate? Maybe continue your education at university? The interviewer asked her, and the answer the girls gave her surprised the interviewer. They said they have no desire to go to school, in fact, had found school boring. Happiness is what you make for yourself right where you are, one girl explained. Getting married and having children for her was the pursuit of happiness. Not one to give up easily, the female interviewer quizzed the girls further. Are they scared to marry or worried that their family has made a bad match? And the girls admitted to having some trepidation, but as they scrutinized their makeup and spritzed their hair and tried on dresses and shoes, and then more shoes, they seemed excited and even eager for the market. But don't you feel like an object? The interviewer asked, and the girls merely smiled and asked her, what do you do in your country when you want to find a husband? And the interviewer said, oh, well, we put on makeup and dresses and shoes and more shoes. And the girls said, well, it's like that for us too, only we don't drink and our parents go with us. So it's not so different, the girls were saying, and yet because of the strict rules regarding moral conduct, courtship for the Roma is different, very, very different. How can you marry a guy if you don't know that you'll work out, physically, I mean, the interviewer asked. How can you marry him if you don't know what he's like in bed? And the interviewer said, I couldn't even think about marrying a man if I hadn't slept with him for a couple of months. And the comment, offered in such an offhand manner, was so clearly foreign to the girls, they had no idea how to respond. Their eyes widened, and for several seconds of dead air ensued. Do a lot of girls in the UK do this? One of them tentatively asked, as if she was afraid of the answer. And it's like this amongst the College. Purity is carefully maintained and guarded. It is the single largest asset that the family has when they are arranging their marriages. And the young people are active and willing and happy participants in the process of preserving the purity because they think in groups. It's all about what is good for the group, what makes my family look good, what makes the rest of my community look good. The idea of pursuing individual happiness, liberty, and freedom, that sounds good, and you'll see it on the American passport, all these phrases. It sounds wonderful, but it would not work in a communal society where everyone has to function as a whole group. So, what does a bride market look like? Well, I'll tell you, the boys stand like this, and they are looking the girls over. The thing is it's not like that documentary would suggest. in which there's no choice whatsoever. As one 13-year-old girl explained to me, we know each other. We go to all these birthday parties. We have time to figure out who we like and don't like, and we have ways of letting our parents know. It's not like they don't take into consideration, some of our feelings. But there are very strict rules of engagement. There's absolutely no sexual contact. The closest they could get is maybe to share a secret like this, and there's still some space between them, you can see. They only marry within their own group. That's very important. And again, the whole purity thing is absolutely important. Anka, the woman in the red shirt that I showed, when she was married, her husband's parents paid 15,000 euros for her, and this was back in 1980. That's a lot of money, and I asked her like a totally indelicate question. I said, well, why did they pay so much for you? And she said, because I was pure, and I'm a really hard worker, and besides, they didn't choose me, I chose him. And I said, I'm thinking, yeah, I bet you did. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, because he had blue eyes, and all the other girls wanted him, but I got him. Yeah, so I said, so it's not just about the money then? And she says, it's so funny. It's really not about the money at all. The money is just for show. It's an old tradition. People exchange this money, but it's really not what it's about. And in fact, if there's a young boy, here's one now. This is Dando. He's 17. I just thought he was such a doll. He gave me a lot of really valuable information. So say there's a young man and he's really got a fancy for somebody, but his family can't afford her. If the girl takes a fancy to him, the family of the girl may actually give to the boy's family the money, so then they can give it back. And it's all a face-saving gesture. So this is the girl Dando wants to marry. He said to me, I don't think I'm gonna get her though, because she's lighter skinned and a lot of boys want her, and my family isn't as rich, so my strategy is to be as charming as possible. I wished him all the good luck. He's pretty charming. I think it'll work out. Which was an interesting thing. We noticed a lot of girls at this birthday party dusting their skin with this white powder called pomada, and the idea is to make themselves look lighter. And though most of them did not have light-colored eyes, they would almost always be wearing green or blue eyeliner to suggest my eyes may be brown, but I still have blue. I almost have blue eyes, which is an interesting idea. And I asked some people about this. What is up with this pomada? And they said, we like lighter skin. We like lighter skin in case it's necessary for us to be even more invisible, and we need to pass. We need to be able to visibly be confused or mistaken for our Bulgarian or Serbian counterparts, colleagues. So any event then is an opportunity to make matches, and any event then is heavily supervised. These are the bastions of purity. And they will get up, and if they think people are dancing too close together or just having too much fun, they'll make sure to put a stop to that right quick. So the idea is to marry the girls off at about 17 or 18 years of age in this particular culture. One man asked me, how old were you when you got married? And I said, 27. And there were 3 men present, and it got very quiet. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Never mind. Yeah, so this is a really typical Roma way of dressing, to have like a t-shirt of some sort, preferably something with a little bit of bling, and maybe a sweater. And then if they were standing up, their skirts would probably be a little bit longer than my skirt. If you're an older woman, it's longer. If you're my age, kind of middle-ish. And if you're young, you can have your kneecaps showing, but no more than the kneecap. Yeah. Do they wear pants? Only the younger women, and it's frowned upon amongst the Kalaji, but there were other Roma groups, the Horahane and Daskane, a lot of women wearing pants. It's fine. It really depends on different groups, group to group, what's acceptable. One little phrase I ran across a couple of times, and it went back to what do we value, what's important in our group, is this phrase, you can't eat beauty with a spoon. Because I noticed there was a really beautiful girl, and it just didn't seem like she was getting the same attention as some of the other girls, and I was told, you can't eat beauty with a spoon. Anka said that. I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, you know, beauty is important, but it doesn't put food on the table. We value a hard worker. We value an honest worker. We value a woman who is a creative problem solver, who would treat her husband and children well and look after them well. If she's beautiful on top of that, great. If not, really not the thing that we're looking for. So the practice of selling brides, or kind of selling brides, was something amongst the Kalaji. They still do it, plan to keep doing it, regardless of documentaries that are made about them. For a lot of other people, the practice they remember is being stolen. So amongst the Daskane in central Bulgaria, typically what would happen is if a young man took a fancy to a young gal and let his parents know, he would enlist the aid of that girl's friends or maybe even her family members to lure her, usually to an outdoor movie or indoor movie, some kind of social event where there would be lots of supervision. And then typically, and I heard this like 5 different times, what they'd do is they would set her watch back by 3 or 4 hours, convince her that that was the actual time, go for a walk somewhere in their neighborhood of their own family, get her to come inside and have dinner with the parents, and then she would realize what the time really was, far too late to walk back home in the dark unaccompanied, so she'd have to spend the night. For a Roma, that means they are now married. If she spends the night under the roof of this young man's with his family, they're married whether or not they have any kind of physical contact. And so this happened in a number of instances. And then when that happens, then the father of the girl will then come and start the negotiations for the bride price. At that point, physical contact might occur, might not, but then they'll have the official wedding in which all the guests are invited, and it usually lasts between 3 and 5 days. In those days it did, and an intricate set of rituals regarding the preparation of the wedding and all of the food and people and gifts. That's very important, all the gifts and documenting it, and if you have wealth you want to show it. So a lot of the photos would have the bride surrounded by piles of pots and pans, not bridesmaids. It's all of her stuff, so that people could see, first of all, she was pure, because you only get the stuff if you're pure, and then what kind of family she's marrying into. This has no relevance to anything. It's just a great photo of this man having a good laugh at our expense. I think I said something poorly. It got translated even worse. Whoops. And then the woman in the background in the red shirt, she's just dying. And that's the best part of doing these kinds of travels and research, is when you have those little whoopsie mistakes and we can all just be human together. This is Radko. I told you a little bit about him, and he arranged for most of all the meetings that took place in Serbia and Bulgaria. And he's worth mentioning because he was able then to sort of bridge the gap between not just anthropological data and figures, which he had access to, but also to this whole legendary and lore and mythology that is known by the Roma, but not written down. So it's not known to most people who are non-Roma unless we know the Romani language and are there and hearing it spoken. So what are those stories? Well, I will tell you. A lot of the stories that are told have to do with the ritual of surrounding death and dying and how best to make sure dead people stay dead. And just about everybody I talked to had a story about this is what happens if you do not bury somebody correctly or you do the funerary processes incorrectly. These are the kinds of hauntings you can expect, and this is the kind of bad luck curses that can happen to you. The tradition around death and dying is remarkably similar amongst a lot of these different Roma groups. So typically, well, any kind of a social occasion is an event in and of itself, but death and dying is probably right up there with a wedding in terms of as a reason to gather and a reason also to work out a lot of things within the family. So in Latvia, when a man is going to a funeral, he is supposed to bring 20 bottles of wine or beer, and it's not for the mourners, I was told, it's for the dead one, and it'll go inside the casket. I was assured multiple times that every gypsy goes to heaven. And I was also told, and this is in Latvia, that if there's a pastor at a funeral, after the funeral's done, there will probably be 3 or 4 weddings before the evening is out. Again, it's a social event. It's an occasion to get a lot of business done. So people actually really look forward to the death, not of their loved ones, but of other people's loved ones. So often when a person is placed into the grave, pieces of broken mirrors are put in coffins as well as cigarettes, and there's this idea that the dead have needs and material objects will make them more comfortable in the afterlife. One woman in Bulgaria told me about a funeral she attended in which they had kind of like on a cart, they had a TV and a radio blaring the whole way to, they had the casket, and then behind the casket's this TV with this person's favorite soap opera going, and also like the radio was going. And then when they buried the person, they had the TV and the radio still going into the grave, into the plot, into the ground itself. And she was told, well, other people might enjoy listening to the soap opera too. So for the Daskane, and Radko was one, he says it's really important that the deceased, and this kind of goes back to that comment about the hospital, the deceased or someone who is about to die is not left alone. And for the first night, the family gathers around, and then the next day, very often a band will accompany the body and the casket to the graveyard. Sometimes in central Bulgaria, they will chop wood to make a cross, and the cross is believed to keep the dead person settled, so they won't come back after the funeral. In Serbia, they will take brooms and turn them upside down. Then the burnt wood, they'll burn wood in a stove and put the ashes by the door. And then as people come back from the graveyard, they're supposed to wash or kind of dip their hands and feet in the bucket of ash. And that's another preventative. And then they'll put a bowl of flour on the table. And then they'll put a big glass of water. And they'll watch it carefully. When they get up the next morning, if they see a handprint in the bowl of flour or they see that the level of water has gone down at all, it means that the dead person is hungry and thirsty, and they will waste no time getting back out to the graveyard and putting food and water back into the casket or around the casket. So all this is really, really, really important because the dead have to be kept happy. If they're not happy, they'll come back and haunt. One woman told me a story in which a family member, she had a sister living in Germany. She was living in Serbia. They had a family member die. It was an untimely and painful death. And this is a family member that not very many people liked very much, sadly. And so the preparations were done hastily, and perhaps not as much care and thought went into it as maybe the sisters say maybe it should have. So after that person is buried, the sister in Germany, she's noticing that she's having horrible dreams every night, as are her children. She feels she's being haunted and that somebody's put a curse on her. So she decides to go visit her sister in Serbia just to get away from all of this bad luck. The first night she's there, she crawls into bed next to her sister. And this is kind of their family tradition, is that the women can all climb into bed together. And then at some point in the middle of the night, they notice a third body climbs into bed next to them. And that woman telling me the story, she said she woke up and she looked, and there was a hand grabbing her arm, and she looked to see, she thought it was her sister, and it was the dead relative had followed. So there were like 100 of these stories, and of course they're true. And the point being, and always the moral to the story was, you must take care of your dying, and you must bury them well, which means for a Roma funeral, excess and lavish abundance is the rule. You want to not only show everyone the wealth that you have, because generosity breeds good luck, but you also want to show the dead the greatest amount of honor possible, because you don't want them to come back and haunt you. So there are so many little rituals regarding how to prevent a haunting to go into the list. It could become tedious, but it was interesting to me to see there is this fluid, kind of seamless line between the living and the dead, and they could speak about the dead in that sense that that the two worlds really cross over very fluidly. Yes. This is a gravesite in Volkanesht. Grieving properly is as important for the dead that has passed away as it is for the family. So whereas in the United States, maybe we put our flowers and our floral sprays there and then kind of leave it, they'll continually renew, and they will spend a lot of time and care on the upkeep of that plot. Some families will go into debt, buying markers, gravestones, little benches to sit on. It's like a family shrine, and so it's a matter of pride and family reputation to keep it looking as well as possible. So if the world of the living and dead is seamless and fluid, there are other parts of Roma existence which are absolutely not fluid and seamless. One is this idea of clean and unclean, and the idea of marime, or what is taboo. And I think I already mentioned the human body is itself the source of all kinds of contagion and uncleanliness. The female body in particular is especially polluted, and that is the reason why in some Roma groups, in a social occasion, men will sit on one side of the room, women on the other side. Children are exempt from this rule up until the time of about puberty. They're considered naturally clean and innocent, so the same rules don't apply to them. And the elderly are considered, because of their age, their status is elevated as wise ones, and so the same rules don't apply. But people from about the age of 13 to something like 70, 75, still follow, have to religiously, very carefully follow all kinds of cleanliness, ritual washing rules, and guard very carefully social interactions so as not to bring shame upon themselves or their family. Women, for example, who pass too closely to a man, should an article of their clothing, the worst thing that could happen is if her skirt were to touch his trousers. She could be beaten. She has shamed him, and then there's a certain kind of ritual that has to happen to unshame her and unshame him. But he's been polluted. Those trousers, they have to be burned. There's no bleach. There's no water wet enough, soap strong enough to clean it. And there are just like millions of rules regarding all of these kinds of clothing and utensils and food. But there's nothing more polluting than contact with outsiders, which you can imagine made my job really interesting, knowing that I'm just the source of all contagion. and morally suspect on every level. It was interesting, but the contact with the outsider is the most polluting agent, and so for many folks, eating in a restaurant that is owned and operated by an outsider is just unthinkable. So a few of you mentioned to me you know of stories or have seen that there have been Roma who've been hired as entertainers to work in a restaurant or something like that. That would be the one exception if they are it's part of their employment. They're sort of given a pass. They can't help it. They have to be in the presence of outsiders. But outsiders, and particularly their food and the way that the outsiders eat their food, is suspicious to them and a source of defilement. So it's if they have to go to a fast food restaurant, for example, if now we're talking about Roma, say in the Pacific Northwest, they will not take a plastic fork or spoon from a communal bin of plastic forks and spoons that maybe you see sometimes, but they will use one if it's individually wrapped in plastic, because that is clean. Anything else that other people have touched, unclean. They're absolutely appalled by the way some people, outsiders, do their laundry, and they mix and match intimate items with non-intimate items. They're appalled that somebody might use a washcloth in the shower on a lower part of their body and might possibly then use it on their hands. That's just not done. It's so unclean. So I was just fascinated by how deeply, thoroughly this idea of cleanliness and purity pervades most parts of their everyday existence, and how, I have to say, it doesn't mine. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Yeah, no wonder they think somebody like me is wildly, extravagantly unclean. They would be appalled. I have an animal. I let my animal come inside my house. They would never do that. Dogs and cats are horrifically unclean. I just think, wow, yeah, there really is a whole lot here. So I'm going to stop and try to leave some time for questions, if there are any.
Hi, I'm Tony. So enjoyable and interesting. My question is about funerals and care of the dead. Are men and women treated the same?
If they've died and they're being prepared?
In terms of being prepared, in terms of the funeral itself, of the extravagance, people coming.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Generally speaking, yes. An older person is shown more reverence. The bigger your body size, your corpulence, that indicates how important you were in the community. So if you're older, if you're fatter, if you're wealthier, if you had more children, these up your level of prestige. And so then the funeral is just, it gets crazy big, crazy extravagant, and the amount of food and the amount of drama, is going to go up, up, up. Yes. In general, yes, they are treated the same.
Hi, my name is Louise. Over here.
You're going to have to, okay.
There. Is there such a thing as the title King of the Gypsies, or is that just another one of those myths?
Yeah.
I also, like Hans, worked in a hospital back in the Midwest when supposedly the king of the Gypsies was a patient, and the entire tribe camped out on the lawn in front as long as he was in the hospital. So is that a real title?
No, and it's really a fabrication for our benefit because it sounds good, and it also sort of lends an extra air of mystery. And what better way to ensure that he'll get the proper medical treatment if we call him a king? And also, 200 people are camping out. Yeah.
Hi, this is Mika.
Okay, hi, Mika.
Given the cleanliness that they're interested in and the divide between Roma and outsiders? Do they tend to be very healthy, little disease, that kind of thing?
You know, you would think that these people would live until they were 110, given their fastidiousness concerning hygiene and cleanliness, but I found that that really wasn't the case. And in Serbia, amongst the Arlia and Tamari groups in particular, lots of troubles with kidneys for some reason, and my host was like, I'm absolutely perplexed by this, but you know, our people die at like 58 and 60 of kidney failure. So I think that nutrition has a role to play with that, because most of the folks I spoke to weren't heavy smokers and they weren't drinkers. But I think that I don't know exactly why, but many of them do not live long.
Yes, this is Nisha, and I'm here.
Oh, hi.
Yes. I also worked at Salem Hospital in the critical care unit, and when we had Queen of the Gypsies as severely ill, and everyone camped out in the waiting room, but we were told that the reason so many had to be in the room was that the last person to touch the Queen after, or as she was dying, or while she was still alive but dying, would become the queen of the group. Now, have you heard of this?
This is a new one for me, but it is, again, common for large groups to camp out. I had a friend whose mother was an embalmer for 60 years in North New Jersey, and the group that they tended to service most were the Romashals. And so camping out and the passing on of like a title or a power was very important. And then you can imagine the sibling rivalry that would occur. So they ran a funeral home, and they learned very quickly that when the Romashals were going to have a funeral at their funeral home, they were going to use plastic plates and cups because of the fallout that would ensue. But they would have the Romashals anyways, would have their deceased prepared by an outsider, because to touch a dead body would be highly, a source of contagion, and would be highly polluting. It would be morime. So they would hire others, not another Roma, but gaje, to prepare bodies. And they would shut the windows, nail them, ask to have the windows nailed shut so that the mulo, the spirit, wouldn't get confused. It's very important to light candles so that the mulo could find the correct way to heaven. So a lot of ritual regarding and tradition regarding death and funeral practices that vary between the Romashals and Northeast United States and, say, the Machvayu and the Kalderash that live in Portland and Seattle and Spokane. They're following some different things there.
My name is Carmen. I had an experience, my first experience with a Gypsy family in Fremont, California, when we were first married, and it was a tract area, our first home. They didn't come out of the house, and they stayed very close to their home, but when they finally had to go to school, they saw that myself and my neighbor across the street, who was Jewish, were probably okay to communicate with. And she told us that she was in a concentration camp. She's from Spain, and she was sent to a concentration camp because she was, she said Gypsy, half Gypsy and half Jewish. And I asked her how she survived, because she had 4 children and a nice family. And she said that when they were teenagers, the Nazis used them for prostitution, so she was able to escape. And she became very friendly with us later and was thankful to have someone she could talk to.
Hello, I'm Roger. And my wife asked the question, you talk primarily about other people accepting them, but at the same time you're saying that they don't except the primary population, it's hard to see how they can be assimilated in any way under these circumstances. And I have a related point, kind of from the Greek ideal of comparing a city to an individual. I'll compare the individual to a group of individuals and say that when an individual does things that gets him beat about the head and face on a regular basis, he changes his behavior, and except for those who somehow just can't do it. And the Roma are not the only group who seem to have this same problem on a group's lifespan of thousands of years. They get beat about the head and face. They don't change their behavior. Have you any comment on either point, the possibility that they will change their behavior? What can be done about it? Anything like that?
Well, as far as changing behavior, I don't think that would happen in terms of Roma have no desire to fully assimilate, because why would you want to become dirty and polluted? So they like their identity, they want to remain separate, but they would like it to be a harmonious non-assimilation. So they would like to be able to have economic relationships that do not get them beat about the head and face. But the idea that they would engage in all the same trades and that they would live precisely as the outsider communities around them live, I think they would find utterly abhorrent. And so the worst thing a Roma could do is marry a non-Roma and have children. For example, that's highly polluting to the entire clan and tribe. So I don't know that behaviors would change. I'm not sure how to define behaviors, but I think certain attitudes about assimilation, I think, will not change. But I do think they are more and more open to the idea that education would further their cause, that they could do better in this life, their children could do better, if they could encourage their children to stay into school a little bit longer and then marry and have children. And I was seeing amongst the Ursari who had some exposure with some education that was a value. Among some of the college, they were encouraging their girls to go as far as high school. Instead of marrying at 13 and 14 to marry at 18. They were seeing that having some education would help them, and in particular learning English and some computer skills would help them. So those kinds of behaviors, I think, maybe might constitute, changes in those kinds of behaviors might constitute an overall change, but I don't think there is a huge desire to become like the other, to be just like their Bulgarian counterparts, for example.
Hi, this is Wes. I was sparked by information about poetry and music, and I thought you might give us a little more information about that.
Yeah, so on the last two trips, I really was earnestly trying to gather poems and, in particular, folk tales. And so I did find an older man who could tell some lost tales that none of the other researchers I had been reading had collected in their compilations of what they were calling Gypsy tales. So that was pretty fruitful. But I noticed they were really long stories. But a lot of them had to do with the importance of being clever and outsmarting your enemy, and whether your enemy is a jealous brother or whether your enemy is an outsider. and the value of, again, purity, marrying the right person, and how a person would determine someone is pure. And there's usually a test, like there's 3 giants that have to be slain, or 3 impossible tests that nobody could possibly do without the aid of some kind of underworld god or goddess or nature. So there were similarities to some of the folk tales from other countries I had come across, and then little flares that made them distinct and peculiar, I think, to that particular Roma tribe. When I would ask people about poetry or music, sometimes they would say, well, that's a cliche. Just because I'm Gypsy, you think I know how to play a violin? You know, like, see, there I go again, I did it. So I didn't come away with as much as I had hoped on these last 2 trips, but I did come across a few people who knew some really old tales, and then the interpreter would turn to me and say, I've never heard that one before. I'm glad. I hope you write that one down. You know, he was really surprised, and this was his grandfather telling the tale. So I never heard him say that one. So sometimes the lesson to me is sometimes you just have to ask the questions, and then people are just amazing. They'll answer.
Here, this is Irene, and I just can't help but thinking the power of culture and how it really is such a big thing to people everywhere in the world. But my question is, if this culture is so into marrying within the group, are there genetic issues, and are there that sort of thing? How do they deal with their handicap members and that whole question?
Well, it's considered an impure act to marry too closely within the clan, so like first cousins, and it's even frowned upon for second cousins. So a great deal of time and energy is put into finding someone who isn't too closely related. So I think that they're aware that that could cause problems. In terms of handicap, I don't know if this is like a Roma attitude toward handicap, or if it's Central European, South Central European attitude, but in general, if someone has a handicapped child, that child is secluded, but not always. What I found was, by and large, family really comes around each other and helps each other out, whatever the issue might be with someone who has some kind of ailment or difficulty, or they're born with something. They really come around each other. Bulgarians and Romanians tend to warehouse their handicapped children and put them in institutions and visit them twice a year. And I visited many such institutions, and I was told time and time again, we Roma, we would never do that to our children. And then they asked me, well, what do you do with your elderly in the United States? I said, you put them in warehouses? I said, well, we call it upscale gracious living. And they said, we would never do that to our elderly. And besides, it might piss them off and they'll come back and haunt us forever.
Gina, you have taken us to a world that most of us knew absolutely nothing about, and I admire your ability. Oh, okay. Thank you. Are you still taking the group to Germany?
Yes, so I have other trips planned, and hope to go back to all of these countries and more. Yes, thank you. You all have been so generous and gracious. Thank you so much.